Well, hello and welcome back to the Insurrection Interviews podcast and to Magic and Ecology, the series of online and in-person events where we aim to think the uncertainty of this planet's future through the possibilities thrown up by the concept of magic or possibility itself. I am Simone Kotva, and today we're talking technosis, high weirdness, climate change, and so much more with Dr. Erik Davis. Erik Davis is a fifth-generation Californian who studied literature and philosophy at Yale and spent 6 years in the freelance trenches of Brooklyn and Manhattan before moving back to San Francisco, his current home. His first and best-known book is undoubtedly Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, from 1998, a cult classic of visionary media studies that has been translated into 5 languages and recently republished by North Atlantic Press. He has since authored 4 books, most recently High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experiences in the 70s, a study of the spiritual provocations to be found in the work of Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson. High Weirdness explores the complex lattice of the strange that flowed through America's West Coast at a time of radical technological, political, and social upheaval to present a new theory of the weird as a viable mode for a renewed engagement with reality. Erik's work has been praised for its ability to take seriously the esoteric underpinnings of popular culture without resorting to mystical dogma, but also without explaining them away. With an intellectual rigor that matches the rationalism of the savants who encourage us to sneer at such things, Erik's experimental critical approach argues that the occult should be seen, at least in part, as an exceptional instance of the human technological impulse. As hazardous as it is to make of this impulse an end in itself, as hazardous is it to throw out the ability to transform human perception and ways of earth living that human technologies enable. As Erik writes, quote, "I hope that we rapidly and creatively expand our range of what the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk calls anthropotechnics, those processes and practices that turn us into perceiving subjects, that train our capacities, that bootstrap our own transformation. Rational calculation should never tame what Sloterdijk describes as the vertical tension that pulls us ever upward and outward and toward the acrobatics of the spirit." Erik's insights on the critical potential and frankly timeliness of the apparently arcane and obsolete is mind-expanding, to say the least. He's been described as a psychonaut whose writing not only describes the weird, but invites the reader to experience it for themselves. As such, his work challenges the notion that human minds are locked into a fatal inability to engage with the strange, the other, the non-human, and more than human. And we're delighted to have him with us on the podcast today. And now to help us explore the world of weird anthropotechnics in the epoch of the Anthropocene, please welcome Dr. Erik Davis. Erik, thank you so much for joining me at the Insurrection Interviews podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
No, it's great to be here. And thanks for that very warm introduction.
Thank you. Well, I think I'd like to begin by diving right in, if you don't mind, and asking about the connection between the occult impulse that you chart in your work and ecological thinking. So I'm thinking about a passage in a foreword to a recent edition of your classic Technosis, where you write, quote, "The ancient Gnostics believed that the cosmic prison was the material world, the world of flesh and fate. But in today's matrix model, the false world has become the world of mediation. Its rulers or archons are not carnal demons, but captains of propaganda and brainwashing. In this new vision, spiritual awakening does not catapult you into an incorporeal heaven, but plugs you back into the actual physical world, a place that follows deeper rhythms than CPU cycles and the hum of global networks. The core of our new gnosis, I believe, is the earth, in all its limitations and extraordinary fecund power. If the original Gnostic moment reflected an emerging sense of the self as a free agent, the latest mutation also gropes toward an embodied awareness of the collective dimension of being. So I'm wondering, that's an amazing, amazing passage. Would you mind saying more about this new gnosis as the Earth and the thinking that's developing in response to the current planetary emergency?
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I'm glad you honed in on that passage. I've been thinking about the Gnostic model a lot lately in terms of trying to understand a different topic, which is contemporary conspiracy theory. And you could say that a more typical way in which a modern person would consider a renewed relationship to the earth, it follows the line of re-enchantment. You know, here's the basic sociological Weberian story that modernity is about disenchantment, and that this disenchantment has left us bereft of connections with the non-human world and has encouraged the West's sort of desire to master and manipulate, and hence leading to the ecological crisis as well as many other crises today. And so if that's your account of things, then the way back, as it were, or the way forward, probably better said, is through some kind of re-enchantment, some kind of disenchantment of modernity's spell, and some kind of restoration of a more intimate, multidimensional, intuitive, and sort of embodied relationship with the non-human world. But I'm also have always been interested in this sort of Gnostic moment, which on the surface has a very different tenor. And again, looking at ancient Gnosticism as a kind of extreme form of, let's say, Christianity, or, you know, there are other ways of talking about it. It's a complicated topic in terms of its historical dynamics. And some scholars believe the term Gnosticism isn't even appropriate in a specifically historical sense. But leaving that aside, we can see in the ancient Gnostic moment a kind of profound world-denying movement away from human existence, which is seen not only as besmirched by sin in some Orthodox Christian account, but actually fundamentally flawed, if not a kind of prison. And we're here for reasons that are not our responsibility, and that the whole goal is to get out, maybe to get out by knowing the secret paths and signs that allow us to move through the planetary spheres after dying, or perhaps through some kind of ritual peak experience in this world, through body techniques or drugs or some other ecstatic practice that would lead us to see and recognize that part of ourselves or of the cosmos that is not of this fallen order. Within that fallen order, though, we have, and it takes different forms in different myths, but let's just again boil it down to an oversimplification. We have the demiurge, who's the one who builds this cosmos, this domain that we're stuck in, either out of ignorance or out of a kind of evil or a kind of narcissism, one could almost say. And the demiurge has some henchmen who are known as Archons. And the term Archon, happens in other traditions. St. Paul talks about Archons when he talks about powers and principalities in a famous line. And in the Gnostic sense of the term, these powers are kind of like the planetary astrological overlords. That is, they control the mechanism of fate, or they are the mechanism of fate. They determine the nature and possibilities of this fallen prison that we're stuck in. So it's kind of like, imagine astrology, except instead of being good guys or mixed bags, the planetary rulers are all essentially malevolent. They're controlling us. They're keeping us from the higher light in this framework, which again is a little oversimplified, but let's go with it. And so the goal of the Gnostic is then to escape, right? To get out of the worldly context and to make it to the world of light. Now, the Archon is a really interesting figure inside of conspiracy theory today. 10 years ago, you would barely see it mentioned. And if it was from people who already knew about Gnosticism because they could recognize the similarity. It's like, wow, the way people talk about our world being ruled by corporations or faceless boards or mind manipulators who are working behind the scenes in order to get us to believe certain things, and that we're sort of locked in this kind of matrix. Like all of that sort of popular mythology is deeply redolent of these sort of figures, these Archon figures. But these days, the term is widely found within conspiracy theory, within the pop entertainment, alternative, counter-journalistic, whatever you want to call the many, many worlds of conspiracy theory, is that the term Archon is quite apparent. And so what's interesting about the sort of mutation of this figure is that it's increasingly become identified with, say, the non-organic life of corporations, or the instrumental mind control that is effected through mass media and the internet, that the faceless corporate boardroom powers that actually control things, that actually manipulate reality, especially within a conspiratorial framework, that this is where the Archons are. And whether or not they're extraterrestrial or demonic almost is beside the point. These guys aren't demons in the sort of traditional sense of the term. They're something else. They are Archons. And indeed, if you look at the history of the word Archon, it does just mean power, such that a prince of an ancient kingdom would be considered an Archon. So it's a political term that has been sort of enchanted or taken into this kind of metaphysical domain. So why is all this important in terms of ecology, which I haven't talked about at all? Well, there's an interesting flip that happens inside of this mythology, something you can point to going back certainly to the 60s, even earlier, but definitely with the 60s, where you start to see that the path of awakening or transformation or rebellion or revolution has to do with overcoming or undermining the power of the Archons, whether they are conceived as simply material secular powers, or material secular powers that are ghosted with some kind of metaphysical principle. The idea is to sort of undermine them, but no longer in light of some higher transcendence where we escape the earth entire, but instead to recover this disenchanted world that we feel is enchanted. So there's a strange kind of combination of a kind of Gnostic paranoia and a, let's call it, pagan love or return to the powers of the earth, and a kind of inversion of these values. And I think you can see this again in popular mythology, if you want to think about it that way, but also just listening to the rhetoric of activists, of people who are deeply critical of contemporary society, of people who are trying to recover a way of thinking about our relationship to the earth that isn't just some romantic sketch of some kind of animistic idea, but like a genuine critical animism, something that we're actively aware of some of the faults of, even as we can continue to practice it and explore it in light of a resistance against our contemporary Archons.
Wow, that's amazing, the way you put that, critical animism as what this Gnostic materialism, I don't know, that's my rephrasing of what you just described, but could you speak more of critical animism, what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things that we're burdened with as inheritors of Christian thought, and particularly Protestant thought, really not so much Orthodox or Catholic thought, but Protestant thought, is this extraordinary emphasis and association of the idea of belief with, let's say, non-secular claims or ways of viewing the world. That is, you know, we have come from a tradition where the very definition of being a Christian had to do with having a belief, a creed. In fact, it's the very act of believing that Christ died for our sins that enacts the transformative moment, the metanoia that allows us to become Christian subjects. But the residue of this is a profound association between belief and anything that smacks of religiosity, including the occult, including spirituality and the sort of modern nebulous sense of the term, so that as secular inheritance of the Christian tradition, we see everything else as believing and us as knowing. You know, that's the framework of modernity. The modern secular intellectual knows, whether it's based entirely on natural science or not. It's a kind of rational knowing, and everybody else, you know, the child, the stoned hippie, the Native American, the ancient, Paleolithic cave artist, they all believe, right? And this makes if we continue to have this attitude and then try to make a turn towards reenchantment and animism, we get really fuzzy-headed and woo-woo. And that's a lot of what you see inside of alternative spiritual movements, which I see not as just kind of, dumb attempts to restore something or kind of whatever. I see them as genuine gestures towards transformative possibilities that are also curtailed for various reasons. And one of the reasons is that if you associate rationality or reason or skepticism, I'm being intentionally loose here because it's just more fun. If you associate that with disenchanted modernity and you want to re-enchant yourself with the earth, then you're going to leave all that stuff behind and become credulous or become merely driven by experientiality or your ideas of experientiality. This is not the way towards a critical animism. So one of the ways to approach a critical animism is to recognize that even in indigenous situations, pre-modern situations, among magic users, among occultists, there is already a dance between belief and skepticism, between theater and critique. There's already a dialectic of enchantment and disenchantment within the world of enchantment we think we left in modernity. And one of the great provings of this is that the idea that modernity is disenchanted, that great Weberian idea, which is very useful and helpful, but it's not an accurate description of the situation. So even this great attempt at disenchantment through the rule of science and development of parliamentary democracy and the development of a kind of popular skepticism, a turn away from supernatural claims, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anybody who's looking closely can see that at the very heart of these secular forces lies enchantment, mythology, intuition, dream, drug. And so when we see that our own disenchantment is riven by enchantment, a critical animism recognizes that the old enchantment had disenchantment within it. And so the critical animism embraces this dynamic, recognizes that disenchantment is part of enchantment, that working with categories of skepticism or reason, while they can be withering. They can leave you with no juice, no spectral light to inspire the soul, no poetry. Can, on the other hand, serve the very deepening of this kind of process, so that we are able to, in some ways, as intellectuals, if you want that word, as people, as critical people, as people who refuse to give up the great traditions of philosophical analysis, of questioning, of skepticism in the full sense of the term, that doesn't mean we can't find our own ways into enchantment, not just on a personal level, but as a position. And of course, I think a lot of thinkers are doing this. I mean, a lot of the anthropologists we read about, who we want to read about animism today, or the critical thinkers who are reflecting on these things, are already working out these dynamics and these dialectics. And so for me, it's just really been, in a way, a kind of relief to recognize that all, the goods of reenchantment are available, not just in terms of personal, a personal sense of joy or connection, or a sort of filling in of something that as moderns we often feel we are lacking, but also in terms of actual inspiration of moving further into forms of engagement with the non-human world that can really develop momentum and allow for different ways of thinking about what do we do with this scientific civilization that we have, that we find ourselves waking up within fitfully here at the what Michael Taussig calls the sort of meltdown period of civilization.
So I guess this leads me to wonder how you define or sort of conceptualize magic. Do you think you could respond to that?
That's a tough one. I spent some time studying a lot of scholarly forms of talking about magic, and it gets tricky. It is tricky, and in a way, I think, rather than offer a sort of account of magic, is it something that is performative? Is it a proto-science? Is it a re-enchanted science? Is it a postmodern act of simply, turning fictions into realities? All of these things, I think, have their place. But what's coming to me now is simply staying with the idea of a trick. And what is a trick? And the way that the idea of a trick already contains something of that dialectic or that dynamic between belief and skepticism, or a theatrical experience and critique. So that part of the trick of magic is that an explanation of magic will do, which doesn't mean we can't try to explain it. We kind of have to try to explain it. And yet, in our own explanations, we cannot help but motivate some of the excess that is part of magical power. That is, we cannot completely disenchant our encounters or our explanations of magic. The magic will seep through those explanations and carry itself forward, at least for some readers or some listeners or some viewers or some practitioners. It becomes a sort of, it's like an open secret. You can't really put it back in the bag, even if you think you have, by offering a very nice, neat, structuralist account of this and that, or how it sort of works to disguise social power in certain ways, blah, blah, blah. We're still there. And sort of in the same way that we're still there suffering and wanting healing and wanting some kind of response. We can be as critical as we want about all of the things that are disguised under the medical impulse and even the language of healing today, and how corrupted it is by a whole set of contemporary conditions and actors. Nonetheless, if we're suffering, if we're hurting, we're up for healing. And there's some magic in healing, whether you want it to be there or not. The idea of some kind of evidence-based medicine that is purely that, to my mind, is a little bit absurd, because there are anthropological, ethnographic factors, even if we just want to call them the placebo effect, which itself is just a kind of stand-in for a whole set of very complex issues. And when we start talking about psychiatric healing, the game's over. We're in a shamanic situation. It's just that we're not very good shamans. But we should never think that the shamans weren't also skeptical, weren't also going, I don't know about that other guy over there. I don't know if he's a real shaman. Oh, maybe I'm not a real shaman. Maybe I got to kind of perform better. In fact, I'm going to do this trick to make sure that it gets communicated that all of those things are there. And so in a way, we're already in the game. We're just not really quite aware of it. But I mean, to give you something a little bit more hands-on, maybe I would say something about magic is a certain way of deploying the imagination in practice in relation to the transformation of actuality, so that it looks at the imagination not as a merely separate realm, but as a kind of extra power, or a kind of fuel, or a kind of interface, which is how I like to think about it. The sort of magic that interests me the most, which has to do with connecting with non-human powers and forces, whether that's in a ritualistic context, whether it's in a psychoactive journey, whether it's in a sort of contemplative opening to non-human forces within the crystalline mind of the contemplative. What I'm really interested in thinking about the imagination as a kind of interface, even like literally we think about it with computers. So I'm sitting here on the computer, and I'm throwing little pulses around this tiny integrated circuit, going through a lot of and or gates. Well, that's not the language I talk. So it's a lot easier for me to look at a screen where I drag a document over to a trash can. Now, where is the actuality? Am I dragging a document into a trash can, or am I moving a bunch of ones and zeros, which is already an abstract language? Am I commanding a bunch of pulses of electrons around a circuit board? Well, I don't know. That's sort of your choice. And if you say that it's not clear, you're already a magician. You're already in a realm where allegory and reality kind of interpenetrate in certain ways. And so taking this idea of an interface farther, I think that one of the challenges of a critical animism, and a particularly good one to avoid the sort of realms of sentimentality, of sort of Disney kitsch, of easy enchantment, of poorly appropriated indigeneity. Not maybe there isn't good, well appropriated indigeneity, but that's a whole question about appropriation that is another topic. But in order to avoid these less than helpful modes as we plunge into a critical animism, is to refine the interface, to look at the imagination not as a site of meanings or as some kind of a zone of sort of extra dimensional depth, but as a kind of instrument that allows a liminal space to emerge between the human with the human's categories, socially constructed or otherwise, and a non-human alterity that I can't think of, or that if I begin to think of, horrifies me or confuses me or disgusts me. So I can't wrap my head around it. So we build an interface, and that interface then, that imaginal interface, which involves stories, it involves narratives, it involves symbols, but it also involves operations, energies, affects, rituals, performances, that zone is conceived not as an end to itself or as some sacred supplement to a gritty reality, but actually more like a lens or a sort of a virtual reality that stands between us and something that is very difficult for us to wrap our heads around. at all. And I think that opening to the other, to alterity, to whether it's cosmic or fungal or electromagnetic or cellular, whether it's about the riotous biome that we all carry around in our guts, we are the other, just sitting here right now, we are alterity. Well, I'm not going to think about that, but if I can start to think about that, even in its horror, like, oh my God, my body is not my body. It's filled with all of these completely non-human creatures that are doing their own thing, eating me, excreting me. What's going on here? It's kind of horrifying. To build an imagination that is able to interact with that, to sit with that, to move with that, to expand into that. That's what I mean by critical animism, where it's informed by science, it's informed by the actual conditions, the actual material and historical conditions of our moment, but it's open to that imaginal work in the light of a deepening relationship with the non-human, one that I think will, if not necessarily inspiring some last-minute glorious environmentalism that can save the day by steering this behemoth Archon-ridden society away from the edge of the cliff, will at least give us the capacity to wake up to our conditioning, and to our real conditions, in a gesture towards the totality of life on this planet, which is like, that's a better way to go out, if going out is what is in the cards. If it's not, it's a much better way of recovering and trying to turn that corner. So I feel some urgency around these issues, even if I think from a lot of perspectives what I've just said today is just kind of gobbledygook.
No, I love that. Magic is the ability to open up to the other, whether cosmic or fungal. I mean, one of the things which keeps coming up in these interviews and the project Magic and Ecology is the way in which magic seems to restore the two senses of the non-human that have been divided or separated in Western minds, which is the natural and the supernatural, the sort of non-human in terms of creature and non-human in terms of supernatural spirit being or invisible thing, right? And as you say, like when you start thinking about magic critically, it becomes that which doesn't allow you to make that separation. I'm reminded also of what Wittgenstein says when he comments on James Fraser's Golden Bough, and he says something to the effect of, even if you give an explanation, you explain the mechanisms of magic, as you were sort of explaining the interface, it doesn't make what happens any less amazing or any less necessary either. And it's sort of that recognition which I'm hearing in your description there of magic is really, really extraordinary. I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit about your latest book.
Absolutely.
And this concept of, because I think it ties in from where we've just been, this concept of the weird and high weirdness, probably unfamiliar to many listeners. I know that you mention in your book Timothy Morton, who also plays with this idea of the weird in his book Dark Ecology, which may be more familiar to some listeners. And I was wondering if you could say more about how the weird and the high weirdness offers this new way of engaging with reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of the weird for a lot of reasons, and I was very happy. I was already kind of thinking about these things when I came across the use of the term by Timothy Morton, by Graham Harman as well, and a number of speculative realists and triple O people who love Lovecraft. One of the reasons they love Lovecraft is not just that he talks about the outside in a certain way or stages the outside in a certain way, but also that he's weird. And for me, I guess I would maybe start out with saying that I when I use the term, then I'll kind of wind up everything. But when I use the term, I'm really kind of thinking of it in three ways that are related, and the fact that they exist in all three registers is part of what makes the term valuable. If you don't have English as a first language, I'm not quite sure how this argument works. But in English, in any case, weird is a very common word. We use it not infrequently in daily life, and yet it's a very untheorized one. It's like a wastebasket term. It's a place where we can put things that we don't really quite understand, that don't really align themselves with other values. They're maybe a little disturbing, a little annoying, a little just off. So there's something elliptical about them, enigmatic, but also common, ordinary, maybe even trashy. And all of those are really important for me. Weird is also the description of a certain kind of fiction, a certain kind of imagination, a mode of horror that is not simply horrible, that also involves at its heart a certain question about what's real and what is fictive, i.e., within weird fiction, the game of the reality of the fiction is very important, and that becomes important to the weird, as well as a certain way of talking about the supernatural, a supernatural that is stripped of its more euphoric, numinous qualities, or if they're there, they're recoded in a somewhat more unsettling way, but really pays more attention to the macabre, the dark, but not again in a high and holy demonic with a capital D way, but something more quotidian, something creepier, and those are all important energies to acknowledge. They're important energies within our relationship to the non-human. That's a really important thing to recognize. It's not all, Bambi and unicorns. If we're really talking about a serious relationship with the non-human, we have to take on a lot of stuff that is going to freak us out. The second sense of weird that I play with is a sense of social location. Oftentimes people compare the weird and the uncanny, and there's a lot of similarities to the effects, or to a weird fiction and uncanny fiction, the feelings of a sort of sense of dread and marvel mixed together. There's a similar psychological kind of flavor, but there's some very strong differences that are worth paying attention to. As intellectuals familiar with the canon, critical theory, we're much more aware of the uncanny as a conceptual space, a space that's marked by Freud, a certain idea of psychoanalysis, a certain idea of literature, all wonderful stuff. But there's a tendency within the uncanny to have it refer to the psychological subject, the uncanny, whether it's the sort of repressed repetition compulsion, or the movement towards, however you want to characterize it, that ultimately refers to the self, to the kind of internal family drama. But the weird, which has no highbrow legacy to it, in fact, it has a lowbrow legacy to it. The weird is found in pulp magazines, crappy science fiction movies, hot rod designs, drug culture. It has a low legacy rather than a high legacy. And moreover, it refers outside of itself to conditions of worlding. It is a more worldly, supernatural tinge than the uncanny. And that pulpiness, that materiality, the way that in a marvelous, B movie, you can see the rubber on the monster, but the monster is still a monster in some weird way that you can't quite put your finger on. That materiality, that approximate relationship to subculture, to low culture, and to fringe culture is really important. So, like, for example, in American speech, in the 30s and 40s, a weirdo was often a pervert. Well, what's a pervert? Someone who's just not conventional sexually. I'm not ready to say that they're actually a pervert. So the weird also has a sense of alterity, not unlike queer in this particular instance. There are some interesting ways of thinking about that, the overlap of those terms, but that's another, topic, a complicated one, but worth mentioning. So those are, two of the three dimensions. And the last one, I think, is the one that's the most controversial, but the most interesting, is that I think the weird is a description of reality. in whatever sense you want that to happen. It is not simply a mode of fictionality. It is not simply a social location or a kind of subcultural world. It is a claim about the nature of reality. It's a small claim, though. It's not a claim for the supernatural. It's not a claim for God. It's not a claim for demons. It's not even a claim for the animist spirits of the forest. The only claim that is made is that reality is sometimes weird, meaning sometimes it exceeds in an in-your-face way what we expected of it. We can talk about that as anomaly. We can talk about that as the paranormal. We can talk about that as a little bit of chaos in the order, but it's an essential kind of orientation that even if it's sort of fictive, every weirdness or anomaly we encounter, if sufficiently investigated, becomes part of the knowledge base, the field of the known, and so therefore is sort of bested. Nonetheless, that very movement has now opened up a new field where new anomalies and mysteries and enigmas appear. So there's still a continuity of mystery or enigma, even if the location changes. I don't think that's entirely true. I think that there are some locations that are consistently weird, and that leads us into kind of a paranormal discussion, or in terms of certain kinds of powers associated with magic. But that's another kind of ball game that we don't talk about right here. But I mean it in a really kind of a simpler way. Even again, like just to make a basic claim, the reality is sometimes weird. Even in your own life, you have like a precognitive dream. You don't believe in precognition. You don't believe that some God is orchestrating reality. You don't believe that time doesn't exist, and yet you have this experience. You know that you dreamt that you were going to run into somebody in a red Ferrari on the corner by this tree, and they were going to tell you something about whales, and that was in your dream. You wrote it down in your notebook, and then it happens 2 days later, more or less, and you're struck with deja vu, almost in a terrifying way. And then you're telling somebody this experience. You're relating it to them. You're saying, "Yeah, I had this dream, and then there it was. It was all happening." And you're like, "What do I do with that? What category do I put that in if I'm not a believer?" You say something to the effect that, well, that was weird, because weirdness is something we all recognize as being part of reality, not just our human experience, but a part of reality. That's an assertion, or that's a game that I play with the term. But it's interesting along those lines, and then I'll try to wrap this up. I think it's very significant that in English, in certain discussions about quantum physics in the 1970s, is that actual physicists, not popularizers, not journalists, started to refer to quantum weirdness. And what they meant was that if quantum mechanics is an accurate description of at least a certain dimension of reality, then the following things come from that. They're following conditions emerge from that description of reality. And those things are so profoundly counterintuitive. They're so rub against our natural, a human sense of reality and causality and time and space, that what are you going to do with them? They're not signs of the supernatural. They're not signs of God. They're not signs that magic is real. And people who try to say that quantum physics becomes a kind of, a sort of substitute for these, or allows you to justify all that stuff, that kind of woo physics, is not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about we need to put these things somewhere. And the fact that they chose weirdness as a place to describe it, such that it is now like a common part of the discourse of physics among popular writers as well as physicists, Philip Ball's new book was like Beyond Weird, because he was like, that's not enough. We got to go farther, or Beyond Weirdness. I can't remember which one it was. It's a good one, though. It's really good. Anyway, that shows us something about what I'm saying about the weird. And so the way that this all comes around to this question of ecology, in my last book, I wasn't really talking about ecological thinking or awareness so much. I was more trying to understand what happens to people who have radical anomalous experiences, psychedelic, visionary, psychotic, whatever you want to say about them, that are really intense, and that they seem to take place not just in the subject, but in physical reality, in social reality. And how do we think about these things? How do we narrate them? What do we do with them? Where do we put them? And that part of the psychedelic legacy is this problem. And so right now there's this kind of, huge psychedelic renaissance, and there's all this discourse, and there's all these new actors, and there's all these new players. There's a lot of cheesy stuff going on. There's a lot of corporate moves. There's a lot of hype. It's a very messy world. And part of what I was seeking to do is just to remind people that if we take these things seriously, and that means sometimes excessively, that we're going to encounter things that we just can't put anywhere. And that wound, that gash, that inability to weave it back into some normalizing discourse, whether it's about physics, whether it's about health, whether it's about psychology, any of those, it's going to challenge that. And that challenge is marvelous, because that challenge is another portal to this non-human, another portal where our imaginations get stressed as they attempt to reach out into a non-human that can be frightening, that can be confusing, that can be overwhelming, but it can also be, dare I say, loving, or at least energetically responsive, playful. There's other ways of talking about it. And so I think that the idea of weirdness, and high weirdness being extreme weirdness and also being sort of high weirdness, that was a way that I was talking about it within a certain 70s culture that I look at in my book, High Weirdness. And, two of the three thinkers that I look at weren't even particularly interested in nature and the environment and ecology. So I don't really bring that forward particularly, though it is an important stream of the book. But I think that the idea itself is in a way it's sort of a way in for, it's a way into re-enchantment for people who really are allergic to woo, because it's like, well, you don't have to get all that other stuff, but there's something already there. It's already lurking in your corner. It's already lurking in your own imagination, this weird as a portal or as another fantastic interface to dimensions of existence, some of which, have to do with death and bodies and rot and ghosts and all this stuff that sort of clustered together, that I think we also have to take on as part of the work of a critical animism. And I think in a lot of ways, critical animism is in a bit of a macabre key, especially now at a time of such dying, of such toxins, of so many Archon games. And so I think it's important to actually underscore that more spectral, crepuscular side of the imagination at this moment in time.
Yeah, and to me that speaks to, again, what Timothy Morton says in his recent books about ecological thinking not being necessarily discourse that proclaims ideas about the environment, but any way of describing reality, of engaging the imagination that encourages us, or has the potential to encourage us, to become more attuned to the non-human. And that's
Absolutely.
precisely what you're describing. And I'm also brought to mind of Gilles Deleuze's books, the ones with Felix Guattari and then the ones he wrote on his own, which are not often thought of as ecological texts, but they do a similar thing to what you're describing. It's the sort of the risk-taking of daring to become a little bit crazy when you read about crazy people, rather than just distancing yourself from them, but trying and testing a bit of what they were doing, because otherwise it's a disingenuous move. And the point of that isn't to just get high, but to transform your perception of reality. And I found that very, very striking with your work as well.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. And it's interesting, Deleuze is very, and D&G were very influential on me, not not necessarily in a very sophisticated way. I know there's a lot of very sophisticated Deleuzean criticism, and then that's gotten sort of attacked in various ways. And I still really love the basic sense of a kind of enchanted materialism in there. But it's almost more of a kind of spirit of the thing, which is that their texts, particularly together, they wanted to do to you as the reader and the thinker what they were describing. So there's this kind of reflexivity to it. There's this kind of a sort of like, you have to go on the ride. You can't just sit back and appreciate the intellectual moves, the concepts, the complications, the critical engagements. In a way, you are also on what they call the witch's flight. There are moments where you're taken, and especially in certain key texts about how to build yourself a body without organs, or about becoming sorcerers, becoming animals. There's clearly a kind of magic that is set loose, but it's also loosed in the text. And that has always been very inspiring for me, because even though I'm a nonfiction writer and I've written in pretty straight language as a journalist sometimes, and then as a scholar, sticking to sometimes very secular forms of sociological discussions, or certain kinds of ways of talking about history that aren't particularly bizarre or super creative, that I've always been rhetorically committed. Rhetorically isn't even the right word. I've always been committed as a writer to trying to communicate in that multidimensional, sometimes intuitive, sometimes poetic way what I'm talking about, so that the ideal reader of High Weirdness walks away with the equivalent of gum stuck on the bottom of their shoe, that they can't get. I can't. Oh, if I touch it, then I get this on my hands, and I don't know what to do with. What do I do with this? And that it's like communicating the conundrum, this sort of fertile conundrum that's haunted by possibilities, rather than kind of arguing for or arguing against, has always been more appealing to me as a writer and as a thinker. And I think of it as like with Timothy Morton, and he very much writes this way as well, as does Michael Taussig, whose latest book I can't recommend enough. The Mastery of Non-Mastery is all about this stuff. It's all about magic, dialectical magic at the end, or at the meltdown of civilization, and the return of the magic hour and its pervasive presence in our new experience, a kind of macabre enchantment. But again, as a text, like Morton's, like other writers I can think of, it's communicating something as well. And to me, that's part of what we do. That's part of what a critical animism does. If it just stays within sociological, philosophical, anthropological categories, argues for, argues against, problematizes, contextualizes, blah, 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 and that's all it does, even if it's useful, it's not being a critical animism. And I think that's what is a very important thing for intellectuals and writers and performers and filmmakers. And it's not a strictly writerly burden, but I think that's a really important thing for us to be pursuing right now, because in that very gesture outside of the frameworks of kind of critical discourse, the very poeticizing of that gesture enacts this kind of critical animism, where there is a dynamic relationship of skeptical or rational functions to imaginative, intuitive, ritualistic, daemonic connections. And so you're actually doing it, and then people pick up on that and they do it, or they do it in their own kind of way. And so I see that sort of hovering on top of critical discourse and kind of interweaving with it at various points, but in other ways kind of becoming its own sort of loosed discourse, which has happened already in many, I can think of other examples, some of which are also in, dark keys. But the whole role of Lovecraft in critical theory is partly what I'm talking about here. But it goes much beyond that, and I think it's the more important registers are not Lovecraftian. They're actually ways of engaging with the claims of, let's just say, indigeneity. That as we recognize in a political and social justice context, the perennial claims and demands and attendant historical horrors that have been suffered by indigenous groups around the world, and in shockingly similar ways, unfortunately, and that we make room in our politics and our discourse for an engagement and space for indigenous voices, perspectives, languages, practices, knowledges. As we do that, there's a sort of call and a claim on us to make, and I'm saying that us as a non-indigenous person, even though we all have our ultimate indigeneity, but let's just work with this construct for now, that there's a way of opening to that is neither attempting to stand in its place, to appropriate it, but also allow for a full engagement as equally enchanted, disenchanted subjects. And I think that's a political aspect of critical animism that a lot of other people are already doing, but that I also think is really important to underscore.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. This was something that came up also in the discussion earlier with David Abram about this sort of need to think critically about animism, because if we're sort of frightened by the term because of the discourse about it, then what we're really doing is shutting down any possibility of thinking differently about the world, which is the aim really of ecological thought. I'd like to, I think, as a final question, and developing on from that, it's something that has come up in the periphery of what we've been talking about, which is technology and the way magic seems to function almost as this missing epistemology in your work that helps activate our thinking about tech and technology. And I think many secretly feel that environmentalism should spurn technology and embrace a kind of anarcho-primitivism, because human tech is always inherently evil. And your work is really good at pointing out the obvious fallacy in this picture. But instead of going with the mantra that technology is neutral, it's what you do with it, you make this really interesting comparison to technology as the special domain of trickster gods, and as the operation of doing tricks. Technology as a trickster, you write in Technosis. And I wonder if you could just say something more about that. I mean, it ties back to what you were saying about magic itself as a trick of shifting awareness and manipulating the imagination.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that question. I mean, I too feel what the Luddite call. When I look at the situation from certain perspectives, I can really see that. And Technosis was written at a certain point in the first, it was written during the first .com bubble. And I'm very happy to say that I didn't really drink the Kool-Aid. I was more interested in how people were spinning their Kool-Aid stories. But at the time, especially having been immersed in a sort of notch earlier internet related cultures in the early 1990s, when there was a great deal of dynamics, there was a great deal of relationship with artists, with activists. There was this sense that something was open, that something was coming, and maybe that thing coming was going to be great. Maybe it was actually going to be kind of bad, but that there was this sort of space, a dynamic space where dreams and social possibilities and new technological hacks and new mutations had a certain purchase. And we can say in retrospect whether that was naive or just, a brief moment in time, which is how I tend to see it. But it infused a sort of willingness to go deeper into the sort of metaphor or analogy or relationship between magic and technology, and to really kind of dive into it, to excavate it historically, to play with it conceptually in terms of relations to the self, to the world, to technology itself. And, in my work more recently, I haven't, done as much of that, although that is a theme in High Weirdness, because all three of the guys that I write about, Philip K. Dick, Robert Anton Wilson, and Terence McKenna, were all deeply technological, science fictional thinkers. And indeed, the High Weirdness space that I sketch has as one of its core elements science fiction in the full sense, as a kind of mode of thinking, as well as a genre of literature. And in a way, it's sort of the same problem. Like, I think about technology within the, in a way where science fiction and science fictional possibilities, including dystopias, are kind of continuous with those actual instantiations. And I think that we can see this even more clearly these days, as the design of actual objects is clearly related to science fictional texts that kind of come earlier. So we're in this sort of science fictional mode. So let's go with it. At the same time, because it's increasingly obvious the way that both media technology and the internet, as well as a variety of kind of electronic control technologies, robotics, the Internet of Things, that all of these things are being woven now into what you could call, in the terms that we started out with, a kind of Archon system, where the best we can hope for is that there's enough of the Archons, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Comcast, whatever, that there's enough of them around so they keep fighting each other. And in the interstices of their fighting, we have a modicum of freedom. Is it that bad? Have we gotten to that? In some ways, yes. In some ways, I think that's the kind of immediate story that we're going to see as we move into a more chaotic 21st century, and the surveillance capacities and the control needs will only increase. So, that's kind of a grim view. So at that point, I'm not as interested in sort of excavating the marvelous magical underpinnings of new technologies, because it's all just part of the hype in a way. But that doesn't mean that that's just a link to more of a Luddite response. I appreciate that response. I think there's some great reasons for it. It may be the last best hope, but I see something more mixed, and I see something that is already kind of more mixed, and that but in terms of what that actually looks like in terms of a program, given the situation that we're in right now, it's really hard to say. It's really, really hard to say. But I really do believe that there are aspects of the new sensing environment. There are aspects of the ways that technology feeds or stages certain kinds of cybernetic or systems theory behaviors and dynamics, that the whole sort of ethos of the hack as a way of approaching reality all have positive potentials inside of a moving forward. They also have negative ones. But it's been more interesting for me to insist on the way, as Bruno Latour talks about, that we have never been modern. If we've never been modern, then that means all these modern technologies we've been using in different ways. But I think another way of saying that, which is a way of including critique and political critique inside of an enchanted mode, is to recognize that, especially when we talk about the relationship between new technologies and the internet, and, for lack of a better term, it's not a good term, it's a crude term, but we all know what I'm talking about, mind control or behavioral modification, we could say. Now, this is really where, we're getting to the thin edge of the wedge, when people recognize, even with the best of intents, who are working for Apple or Facebook, that every decision they make at a certain decision point, in terms of design, in terms of information flow, any kind of rejiggering of the algorithms, that it doesn't matter. In all contexts, we're talking about behavioral modification on some level. So we're already there, right? So then how do we think about that from a perspective of critical animism? Well, that's where the categories of sorcery start to become valuable, not simply as metaphors, but also as ways to understand the subjective challenge of wrestling with such forces inside of your own discourse, your own worldview, the worldviews that you have and hold with other people, how these things get played out in social communities. I mean, it's not a panacea. It's not an answer. You can't just go around saying, oh, we're all being ensorcelled. That's not very helpful. But to recognize that part of the problem is a problem of the soul, in the way that the realm of sorcery, the realm of shamanism is a realm within which the soul has a dynamic force, that to recognize that our problem is also a problem of soul lets us also be hopefully open up to those more positive and energetic modes of animism that are waiting in the wings. And I think a lot of people, like you say, can't go there because it's just too ridiculous. You can't, a lot of people, they just can't think their way into any sort of like, what, you're telling me The Rock is animated? What? It doesn't work. So in a way, it's like we got to get everything a little bit more enchanted. And that means even the most banal technologies that we engage with, the surveillance devices that are now distributed through our environment, well, in some ways they have brought us back, as Philip K. Dick once talked about in a 1970s interview. He talked about the way that as our physical modern environment gets more and more filled with cybernetic devices, sensors, surveillance, tracking, et cetera, it begins to take on the very quality of animation that pre-modern people saw in the natural environment. Well, do we embrace those metaphors? Do we let them work on us subconsciously? I say we embrace it. We go in there with imagination. We go in there with a critical animism, because even if we don't believe in an animistic or re-enchanted model, a lot of the rhetoric that surrounds those devices is still keying to those aspects of ourselves. They're fully aware that we have souls that respond to these things as sorcerous probes. And so there's a way in which the whole language of technology, how it's been played out, and this is what Technosis is excavating, is already enchanted in manipulative as well as sort of more organic ways, you might say. So I think it's actually helpful to bring this on in contrast to a still very widely held belief, particularly among intellectuals, particularly among critical thinkers, among secular thinkers, that anything that smacks of enchantment from the inside, where it actually feels enchanted, is necessarily a problem, whether it's proto-reactionary or it just disturbs your mind, or it makes you unable to deal with the critical thinking required. And I don't think any of those things are inherently true, and that we're at a place where even from out of desperation, we sort of need to bring in the spirits and the allies as we attempt to think and respond and dream our way through this sorcerous time.
That's a brilliant place to stop, I think, with sorcery not simply as a metaphor. Thank you, Erik, for taking the time to speak on the podcast. It's been a really amazing hour.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
And I wanted to just mention to the listeners out there who want to learn more about your work that they should please check out your amazing website and main archive, which is technosis.com. And you'll also find links there to the Expanding Mind podcast and to Erik's new project, The Burning Shore, which you can learn more about on erikdavis.substack.com. And now it only remains to thank you, the listeners, for tuning into the Insurrection Interviews podcast. The podcast is part of Magic and Ecology, a year-long series of talks and online events where we invite researchers thinking about magic in relation to ecology and practitioners working with magic to transform modes of earth living in order to enable collaborative thinking across disciplines and practices. Magic and Ecology is hosted by the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities of the University of Cambridge, and co-convened by Hjördis Becker-Lindenthal, Sophie Lunn-Rockcliffe, and myself, Simone Kotva. For more information and details of how to sign up for our upcoming live online events in 2021, please visit our website at magicecology.crash.cam.ac.uk.